Today we're going to begin our study of Homer's Odyssey. Our essential question is, how does the journey of Odysseus reflect the universal human quest for identity, belonging, and personal growth? These three parts, these three themes are important to us as we look at the Odyssey because one of the things that makes great literature timeless is its universal connections to us. Even though the Odyssey may be 3,000 years old, people were still people. And even today, we ask ourselves questions about who am I? Who am I becoming? Am I part of a group? Do I belong in this group? And how am I growing as a person? As we read the Odyssey, Odysseus primarily, but also some other characters are going to face these same questions within themselves. And so we should be able to connect, even though we're here in the 21st century. Now, you may not know much about the Odyssey. This particular text here was from the 15th century, and so that would make it the 1400s, so it's pretty old, around the time Columbus discovered America. The Odyssey itself is a poem, and it's 12,000 lines long. Now, you can relax, we're not going to be reading the entire Odyssey. It predates written language, which means it was memorized and passed along. 12,000 memorized lines passed along before it was written down for the first time. It dates to about 1,000 before the Common Era, so we're talking about 30 plus centuries ago, and the first English translation of it was not actually set down on paper until 1614. That's 2 years before the death of William Shakespeare, to put that in a little bit of perspective as well. Now, you might remember, speaking of Shakespeare, when we studied Romeo and Juliet, we talked about Shakespeare's meter was the iambic pentameter. And we said that iambic meant that each foot of his poetry was made up of two syllables, one weak syllable followed by a strong syllable, and that there were penta, or 5 of those in each line of poetry, which gave us a total of 10 syllables, which followed a weak, strong pattern. Remember, we talked about the sound of the heartbeat, the ba-dum, 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 where the first syllable is weaker and the second one is stronger. Now, in Greek, Homer's poetry was written in dactylic hexameter. Now, you might also remember that when we talked about Romeo and Juliet, we looked at the dactyl as well, which is a different foot of meter. The dactyl is very similar to the iamb, but instead of being weak followed by strong, it's a strong followed by a weak. So, for example, if I were to take a 2-syllable word, a word like below would naturally be an iamb. It's like I am, right? Remember that? I am a pirate with a wooden leg, and so it would be weak strong. A dactyl, on the other hand, would be strong-weak, like under. 2 words, under and below, have essentially the same meaning, but the meter would be very different. And unlike Shakespeare, who used 5 of these feet per line, our version of the Odyssey would have had 6 of them. Now, the problem is, hexameter just doesn't translate well into English. And so what you get with the Odyssey is you sometimes get people translating it into prose. Prose would mean it reads just like a novel or a short story with paragraphs and sentences of varying lengths. Or they put it into poetry and they use a different meter. And that's what we're going to be reading in this unit. We're going to be reading the Bates translation, which is poetry, and the meter's a little bit flexible at times, makes it read without as much difficulty kind of figuring out the syntax and things like that. I mentioned Herbert Bates, so his translation was done in 1929, but there are many scholars throughout the centuries who have translated the Odyssey into lots of languages, but for our purposes, English, and some are prose, some are poetry, and they're not all exactly the same because languages don't always translate directly and choices need to be made. But we'll be reading the Herbert Bates translation. The Odyssey is actually a sequel. It's a sequel to an earlier story called the Iliad, which tells the story of the war at Troy, the Trojan War, you'll probably know. We'll talk about that in a second. And what makes this story kind of, at least I think anyway, very modern, is the story is told in media res. And that's a Latin expression that just means it starts in the middle. And we know lots of stories. If you've ever seen, for instance, the movie Forrest Gump, the story starts close to the end of everything with Forrest Gump sitting there on that park bench. And as anybody sits down next to him, he tells the story of everything that led up to how he got on that park bench. And then, of course, the final part of the movie is live action when he goes off to see Jenny. As far as themes and concepts that we have in the Odyssey, like I said, these are going to be things we can still relate to. One of them is going to relate to the Greek concept of hubris. Now, hubris is a certain type of pride. And I know we say people should be proud of their accomplishments, proud of themselves, have self-confidence, but hubris goes way beyond that. Hubris is the point in a Greek story where a character actually begins to challenge the superiority, you might say, of the gods. And they always get punished for that. And punishment comes from the Greek goddess of punishment, Nemesis, but we can actually call the punishment itself Nemesis. So every time you see a character in the story showing excessive pride, hubris, you can guarantee that punishment will follow. Now, Odysseus is going to be a little bit different. He's a hero, and heroes in Greek culture at this time, they were allowed to brag as long as they did not as long as they didn't not compare themselves directly to the gods or suggest that they didn't need the gods. That was going a little bit too far. But they would definitely brag about their superiority to other people, and that was always defended in their ability to prove it. If somebody came up and said, "Oh yeah, prove it." Another thing you're going to find in the Odyssey throughout is something that the ancient Greeks had. It was a code of hospitality, and it was the idea that within your home, you should give whatever you have to visitors, even if those visitors are strangers. Even in some cases, if those visitors might even be dangerous enemies. Now, one of the beliefs of the reason this came about is the idea that Greek gods often traveled and appeared to people in disguise. And so you always wanted to be nice to the guest of your house because you didn't know if it could possibly be a god in disguise. Now, this code of hospitality went two ways. You were supposed to be a good host, but you were also supposed to be a good guest. And in the Odyssey, we're going to have something interesting going on, where while Odysseus is wandering and trying to get home, his queen of Ithaca, his queen Penelope, is at home, and she has taken in certain guests, and they get to the point where they become absolutely intolerable. They break all the rules of being what a good guest should be, even though she makes every attempt to continue to be a good host. And in the end, you know that that's going to be hubris, and so punishment will follow. So it's no secret at the beginning how the Odyssey is going to turn out. But some stories are less about how they end and more about how we get to that end. And I think that's probably true for the Odyssey. The other theme in here is wandering. This is a story about a man wandering the Mediterranean for 10 years, trying to find his home, trying to get back there. He's essentially lost, even though he's a great hero. And this is another one of those common themes, because whether it be you be physically lost sometime and you're too stubborn to stop and ask directions, or sometimes we're spiritually lost or morally lost. Sometimes we're not sure where we want to go in our career next, and so we do a little wandering in there. Another thing we're going to have is the theme of loyalty. Disloyalty gets punished severely. And in our story, people want to be loyal to the king, but if you think the king isn't coming back, your loyalty begins to wane. And so people do some very disloyal things. And remember, Odysseus is our king. He's the king of Ithaca. And so again, Nemesis will likely follow. And then, of course, there's vengeance. Nemesis would come from the gods, but a hero like Odysseus, who's been wronged, who's been betrayed by people he trusted, by people who should have been his subjects, he's going to get his vengeance on them. And in these old Greek stories, it's awfully bloody and violent. So the story comes to us, we believe anyway, from a man named Homer. Not that Homer, that's the wrong Homer. Although The Simpsons did a great 15-minute adaptation of the Odyssey, called it Homer's Odyssey, and Homer played Odysseus. Our Homer is actually someone who may or may not have actually existed. We presume that Homer existed, but we have no solid evidence. And if he did, he's certainly one of the made some of the biggest and most important contributions to Western literature that we've ever seen. Again, if Homer existed, it's presumed that he was what we call a rhapsode. And we know there were other rhapsodes. Even if Homer never existed, there were plenty of rhapsodes, and this story probably comes to us from one or several of them. You'll see part of what, it sounds a little bit like rhapsody if you look at the way the word is shaped here, and that's exactly where it comes from. If we translate rhapsode directly into English, what it literally translates is song stitcher. Someone who stitches together lots of songs to make a bigger one. Now that word song is a little different for the Greeks than it is for us as well. In ancient times, the word song meant poem. So it may not have been melodic, but it definitely was rhythmic. And you have a lot of rhythm in things like a rap music, for instance, which also draws from the same root here. But what we've got in the Odyssey is we have an epic. And an epic is a great big adventure made up of lots of smaller adventures all kind of strung together. One other thing about the rhapsodes, we believe, is that they traveled. They were probably homeless, they traveled, and if you wanted some entertainment for your guests, you would invite them in. You'd show them hospitality, you'd give them a feast, and as part of their repayment for the kindness that you're showing, they would entertain your guests with their stories. And the stories would often go on for many evenings. So this wasn't like sitting down and watching a 1-hour episode of your favorite television program. This would be a major event where every night people would feast, then they'd sit around and they'd hear the rhapsode tell the next installment of the story. They'd sleep that night. The next day, there'd be another installment of the story. So the longer the stories were, perhaps the longer the rhapsodes got to stay in the nice home where they were entertaining. A lot of times you see statues of Homer and he appears to be thinking. He appears to have his eyes closed, looking up, or sometimes it looks like he doesn't even have eyes. Some people have suggested that perhaps if he existed, he was blind, and that traveling from house to house, telling these stories was a way that he found he could survive. Because in the days of ancient Greece, if you had physical weaknesses, the society essentially had no use for you. You were seen as a kind of a weight around their neck. And so if you were blind, to envision stories and to be able to bring them alive for the entertainment of others was probably a very smart way to make your living. Now, we don't know about this either. Some scholars believe there was something called the Homeridae, and what they would essentially be were the descendants of Homer who continued to follow in his footsteps. The stories were passed down, from one generation to the next, and that this is how the stories stayed alive. Because again, remember, they were oral stories long before they were ever written down, and so they had to be memorized. And one of the things you'll see in the Odyssey is that poetry and the meter of the poetry helps make a story easier to memorize in the long run. And you'll find these repeated phrases. We'll use a lot of what are called epithets. We'll talk about those soon, but epithets are sort of like descriptions that go along with a name or a person, and they'll just be repeated again and again and again as the story goes along. It's not an attempt to be repetitious, but a lot of scholars believe that by repeating those common phrases, it actually gave the storyteller a moment of pause. Instead of saying or something like that, the epithets gave them the chance to repeat something that was like singing the chorus of a song while their brains were kind of going to the next part of the story. And then, of course, as the story goes on, we'll look at the influences of this particular story, because in Western literature, in the time of Shakespeare, for instance, it was absolutely central to your education. Students learned Greek, they learned Latin, and there are Roman versions, adaptations of this through Virgil, but they would translate these as their studies. And so the influence of Homer today is all around us. if he even existed. What's interesting about the Odyssey also is that it's a sequel. So it follows up on the story of the Iliad. So the Iliad is a long, adventurous story about the war at Troy, the battle between the Greeks and the Trojans. And why is it called the Iliad, instead of Troy? And it's because the Greek word for Troy was sometimes written as Ilias, sometimes written as Ilium. Probably has to do with the derivation, of the word for particular uses and things like that. In mythology, so we believe, we'll talk about this later in the unit, but we definitely believe that there was a war at Troy between the Greeks and the Romans. And we have some evidence to show that today, some pretty incontrovertible evidence, actually. But at the time of Homer, it was the mythology which was the start of all of this. And it started with a wedding between Peleus and Thetis, and the gods and goddesses were invited. Hera was there, Athena was there, Aphrodite was there. And if you don't remember from perhaps middle school, Hera was the queen of the Olympian gods in Greece. She was the wife of Zeus, the king of all the gods. Athena's the daughter of Zeus, ironically not of Hera. Athena sprung full grown in her armor from the forehead of Zeus, but Athena's the goddess of wisdom, and she's a part-time goddess of war. And then there's Aphrodite. She's the goddess of love and beauty, and the mother of Cupid. Now Cupid, of course, would be the Roman name, which we use at Valentine's Day. It would be Eros in the Greek. Anyway, these three were at the party, and one goddess not invited was Eris. And Eris is the goddess of discord. She's the goddess of arguments. It seems to me you wouldn't want her at your party, but if you don't invite her to a party, she's going to cause some discord. And so the legend goes, the mythology rather, says that Eris tossed a golden apple in among the guests. And on that golden apple was inscribed the words, "For the fairest." So what immediately began to happen was that Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite each claimed that apple. They each believed they were the most beautiful and should have it. And so ultimately, there was going to be a contest held. Which one of them should receive the apple? And what happened was, well, hang on to that for a second, because we'll get there in just a moment. But what's important about all of this before we get to more of the story of the Iliad is that the Greeks and the Trojans worship the same gods. And that's going to be a little bit of a problem, because when the conflict begins between the Greeks and the Trojans, some gods are going to side with the Greeks, some gods are going to side with the Trojans, and it's great to have a god on your side. Wonder what it's like to have several gods on your side when your enemy also has a few gods on their side. And it's one of the things that's going to draw this war out, so that the war itself is going to last for a period of 10 years. But anyway, let's get back to that story of the golden apple, because in Troy, there's a king. His name's Priam, and he has two sons, Paris and Paris's brother, Hector. And what happens is Paris is chosen by Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite to be the judge. It's going to be his job to decide which of them gets that golden apple. And they don't really want him to be completely impartial. And so over time, each one of them comes back and bribes him, offers him gifts in exchange for picking her. And ultimately, Aphrodite promises him, if you pick me, I will give you the most beautiful woman in the world to be your wife. And so Paris does that. Unfortunately, the most beautiful woman in the world happened to be already married, and she was married to King Menelaus, the king of Sparta, the most warlike of all the city-states of Greece at the time. In short version, Paris steals away Helen, takes her back to Troy, and Menelaus decides, that's it, we're going off to war. Menelaus' brother is Agamemnon. He takes over as commander-in-chief of all of the Greek forces. They build ships. They spend about 2 years getting ready. And with heroes such as Achilles and Odysseus, they are going to go off and fight this war, which becomes a siege. The Greeks are basically going to surround the city of Troy, and for 10 years they'll be fighting as they try to starve them out and win the battle. But like I said, the gods get involved on both sides of this. Incidentally, Odysseus didn't even want to go off to war. He had recently married Penelope, he was the king of Ithaca, another of the Greek city-states, and just had a baby son named Telemachus. And so when Agamemnon came for him to get him to join the army and go off to war, there's a great story of how Odysseus decided to pretend he was insane. And what happened was Agamemnon and Menelaus tested him. They proved that he wasn't insane. See, to prove that to continue on his path of insanity, Odysseus would have been forced to slay the son that he wanted to stay home and be with. And so he refused to do that. They realized he wasn't insane, and so he was obligated to go off and join the war effort. So his son is a newborn as he leaves. He's going to be 10 years old as the war comes to an end, and he's going to be, since Odysseus spends another 10 years wandering to get home, Odysseus' son Telemachus is going to be approximately 20, coming into manhood at the time that Odysseus returns. So people often ask the question, why are we reading this classic old stuff that isn't as, well, I don't want to say it isn't fun. It's absolutely fun, but it's not as easy to read as one of those quick reads you get from our library. Number one, it's packed with epic storytelling techniques. An epic is an adventure after an adventure after an adventure, and the storytelling pulls in the violence and the lust and the blood and everything people love today when they still go off to the movie theater to see a great tale. The other thing is it shows us a little bit into, gives us some insight into Greek culture and what it might have been like back at that time period. And then the last thing, as we talked about with our unit essential question, is those universal human experiences. Even though we're looking at a story that's more than 30 centuries old, as human beings, we can still relate to it. We can still have empathy for the characters. We can, in fact, not only can we, but this is something you should do as you read. You should try to think of the experiences that the characters are having and compare them to experiences you've had in your own life. Now, you may never meet up with a six-headed monster who wants to eat your coworkers, but you've still faced challenges where you don't know what the right way to go is. You face challenges where you will anyway, where someone may be hurt and able to use to help someone else. So look at these human experiences and do your best to make connections to them personally. Now, when you read the Odyssey, got to be honest with you here, this is not going to read like a light short story. This is going to require your attention. And so number one, turn off distractions. Put your phone away. Every time you stop to make a text, you've got to get your mind back into what was going on, back into what that last sentence, in the poem, that last line of poetry was. Music can sometimes be nice in the background, but the reality here is that if that music is something you're actually actively listening to, you will not be able to work with this story. So find yourself a place where you won't be interrupted and where you don't have distractions. Second of all, read actively. This means you've got to stop and think as you're reading. This isn't one of those stories where you can prop yourself on your back in your bed and just go through it as if you're watching a movie. You're going to need to be involved here. One way to stay active is take notes as you read, or even better, since I've given you a photocopy of the excerpts that we're going to be reading, annotate them as you read. Highlight passages, underline words, write questions in the margin. If you come across a sentence and you're not 100% sure what it means and you put it into your own words, write it in your own words in the margin next to that. One of the things that I'll be doing as your teacher is if you come to me at some point and you say, Mr. Heffner, I just don't understand this, I'm not doing well on the reading check quizzes because I'm having trouble, I'm going to say, well, let's take a look at your notes or annotations. If you don't have any to produce, then that simply shows me that you're not engaged actively in the reading, and I can't do that for you. I've said to you before, I don't believe there is any such thing as teaching. There's only learning. And if you won't be involved in your own learning, there's no way I can teach you. We haven't figured out a way to just simply get an education via an injection or a pill. Another thing you really ought to do, I know this feels silly, but read it out loud. Remember, the Odyssey was made to be told. It was a performance. It's not made to be a novel. And when we did our Shakespeare, when we did Romeo and Juliet, one of the reasons we read it out loud and acted out some scenes is because that's what it's supposed to be. It's not a novel, so read it out loud. Hear the words. Another thing reading out loud can help you with is syntax. So it's important when you read poetry to read the punctuation. Don't stop at the end of every line. If you stop at the end of every line, you're stopping in the middle of an idea. If there is no comma, if there's no period, keep going till you get to the next piece of pause punctuation or end punctuation. The other thing is to keep the historical context in mind. Sometimes our characters will be doing things that don't seem completely right to us. For example, Odysseus is going to, he fathers many children in his journeys. He has relations with several different women. Some are human, some are witches. At least one is a witch anyway. One is a minor goddess, and he's going to father some children. Even though the whole time what he wants to do is he wants to get home to his wife, and that's part of ancient Greek culture. A king in those days would have had a queen, but he also would have been entitled to several concubines, several sexual partners, just simply for his own pleasure. That's very foreign to us today, but if you allow yourself to be offended by that because you're applying your own moral standards, you're going to find a roadblock in sort of getting below the surface of the text. Another thing you can do is turn to support resources. The Odyssey has never been in copyright, and so one of the things you can do is go online, look for some support, look for some translations. This is a perfect time to use that AI that some people use inappropriately. Go to an AI, ask it some questions. It can definitely help you out because this is world knowledge. This is not something that is restricted to an author who copyrighted a novel 3 years ago. And then finally, what you want to do again and again and again is find out where you fit in with this story. And I don't mean that you were on the ship with Odysseus. I don't mean that you fought at Troy. But these stories, which are in a time period and a location that are very far away from us, they have a religious background that is definitely different from anything you'll find in the United States today, regardless of your beliefs. And yet at the same time, the human condition is still the same, right? We all love, we all feel fear, we all question our own confidence, we all wonder where we're heading in our lives at certain times and what's the best way to get there once we figure out where it is. So keep in mind that reading is an interactive process. It's not passive. You don't simply sit in front of a text and receive what it says. You have to make the meaning by bringing your own experiences and thoughts and ideas to the ones that you find in the text. All right, that's our introduction to the Odyssey. I hope you're going to enjoy this unit, and let's get started on the unit.